Welcome back, everyone, to our final part of our look at the Schlieffen Plan, which was Germany's plan to deal with a two-front war in what became known as the Great War, or what we know today as World War I. This is the second part of Cody from Alternate History Hub's video on what if the Schlieffen Plan succeeded. It's only about a 5-minute video, so this won't be a real long reaction look today. The rest of my time today is going to be spent getting another video ready for you guys, which should be up later tonight, Eastern Time, and that is just basically my preview video of my trip to Eastern France, which is now just 3 weeks away, just to let you see some of what I'm going to be covering in that video, and to offer your own feedback into what you'd like to see from that trip. All right, let's dive into this one.
If you haven't seen part 1 to this video, I suggest clicking here to get caught up, or you will be very confused. When war broke out among the great European powers, Germany already had a military plan in mind, one to combat both the French and Russians on its borders. This was the Schlieffen Plan. The German army would invade through neutral Belgium, bypass the French defenses, and quickly capture the capital of Paris. Then, when France was subdued, the Germans would send troops to deal with the Russians. However, in our timeline, the plan failed drastically. The Germans were stopped at the Battle of the Marne, and eventually both sides dug in for what would become 4 years of stalemate and the horrors of modern war.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to note, to understand that World War I did not start as trench warfare. I mean, when everybody thinks of World War I, that's what they think of, is trenches on either side that stretched all the way from the English Channel all the way down to the border with Switzerland, no man's land in between, and, you know, paying a heavy price for just a few meters of ground, things like that. The first few months of the war were not like that. It settled into that once the Germans couldn't take Paris. Once the Schlieffen Plan failed, it settles down into trench warfare, at least on the Western Front.
In part 1 of this video, I asked, what if the Schlieffen Plan had succeeded? I was able to briefly cover some ramifications of the scenario, but due to time, I couldn't go into detail about the significance. This video will basically be a way to go into more detail and put this all into perspective. In this alternate timeline, if Germany and its allies won World War I, we would see a completely different 20th century. Potentially, a very German 20th century.
Yeah, and you know, I won't leave it paused on that particular image.
No, not in a Hitler and a Nazi sort of way. World War I set the stage of who would be the winners and losers in this modern century.
Yeah, and you know, we talk about it all the time, how everything's connected. You know, without World War I, there is no World War II as we know it. Without that, there's no Cold War and everything that came afterwards. And it's true if you go back further, too. I mean, you know, you can draw the lines between the 7 Years' War, the French Revolution, or the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the Franco-Prussian War, World War I. All of it is connected, and all of it is a part of a series of events that if you change one event, everything that comes after is completely different. And think about that in your own life. That's true in your own life as well. You can think back to moments in your life where there were decisions that you made, and if you had made a different decision, the whole trajectory of your life could have been different. I had 2 job offers at the same time. And it was actually one place that I interviewed, and because I interviewed at one particular job, I got an interview at another job because somebody heard about my first interview, and it was at that second interview that I was offered the job where I would meet my wife. So if I had never interviewed at that first place, I never would have gotten the second interview. And then when I chose, I was offered both jobs. If I had chosen the first job, I never would have met my wife. The entire trajectory of my life was completely different because of one decision that I made, and it was a really close decision. Same thing's true in history.
Even though at first, it was never meant to. The Austrian, Ottoman, and Russian empires all dissolved in the fighting. Russia eventually became the USSR. The British and French were severely weakened, and battle lost its prestige, changing the mindset of the two nations. The United States came into the global stage, fighting in Europe for the first time ever, and with Germany, it ended over 4 decades of German ascension. It doomed its potential in the modern world. The war set it down the path of economic turmoil, Nazism, and after World War II, the country was split between the Soviets and the West, until being only reunited 20 years ago.
Yeah, so think about that. I mean, first of all, it's important to note that, I guess it's been a little more than 20 years now, but I know this video is like 6 or 7 years old. But think about, Germany is still one of the most economically influential and powerful nations on Earth to this day. Imagine how much more so if they win World War One. Without the loss in World War One, without the loss in World War Two, how different is Germany on the world stage? Now, somebody made the comment yesterday, and it's a very important observation to make, that Germany didn't have the Navy to necessarily compete with, say, the UK on the world stage, even if they win World War One. But I would argue that if they win World War One, that Germany then is going to be in a position to be able to ramp up, because they'd been in this kind of naval arms race with the British for a decade or more before World War One. And that Navy was largely scrapped after World War One. They had to basically give up a lot of the ships that they barely even used, other than at the Battle of Jutland. So I think that a win in World War One gives them the ability then to ramp up. They probably gather up some more overseas colonies, which gives them some more economic muscle, gives them some more available resources to build up that Navy even more with. I think they do then compete with the British for a most powerful Navy in the world, and that does allow them economically to become a superpower.
World War I defined the history of the modern German state and people. In this scenario, Germany defeats France automatically, and Britain never gets involved in the war. Germany is able to defeat Russia much more quickly. If the Schlieffen Plan had succeeded, there would not have been something known as World War I. It would have been the quick war Europe had expected. Since the massive war never happens, actions wouldn't be taken to prevent another bloody drawn-out fight, because the 19th century tactics didn't prove a failure. The idea would actually be reinforced and remain relevant well into the 20th century, until another brutal war occurs. Odds are there would eventually be a conflict between France and Germany. France could have become resentful at the loss against Germany, spurring outrage among its citizens against the government.
French words. Yeah, I think there probably is another war at some point. You might see exactly in France what happened in Germany, because you had a very strong socialist movement happening in France, and in fact, one of the events that happens very early on during the war time in 1914 is the assassination, I think, of like the main socialist leader in France, and it was a pretty big deal at the time. So I could very easily see a very strong socialist movement taking hold in France, much like what we saw with the Nazis in Germany, and that could, if you get the right leader in there, lead to a situation where then you have an eventual further conflict, a third war that breaks out in less than a century between France and Germany.
World War I was just one of the many conflicts between the two. In our timeline, the war destroyed the German monarchy. In this alternate timeline, the German Kaiser remains a prominent figure for the 20th century. His power would be weakened by more democratic or socialist forces in Germany, making the monarch a simple figurehead. Germany, in fact, could have become influenced by socialist elements, since Marxism was strong in the country at the time.
Now, if Germany wins the war, I just don't see that happening. I feel like, if anything, it would have strengthened the monarchy if he won a quick war there.
This is just one path, however, depending on if another war would occur or not. The brutal effects of the war was what brought on the Russian Revolution so fast, but in this alternate timeline, the Tsar would be losing considerable power down the road, even becoming a constitutional monarch or losing power altogether.
Probably.
What is certain is Russia never would have fallen into a Stalin-esque style USSR.
Yeah, because that almost didn't happen anyway, because there was a second revolution that led to the communists taking power. They overthrew the previous revolution because it was weak and a relatively ineffective government. And without World War I just don't see the groundswell of support for the communists.
Even if it did adopt some form of socialism, it's practically impossible Russia would have become Stalinist. The United States in this alternate timeline remains isolated and less politically influential as the powers in Europe. It would be an economic powerhouse, yes I said it, but militarily on the global scale would be dwarfed by the empires. World War I made winners and losers, but World War II solidified the fate of one big loser, Europe. If World War I never caused World War II, Europe wouldn't have lost its global empires. If Germany won a quick war and another war didn't happen down the line, Europe's great powers would stay in power across the world.
Not entirely sure that's the case. Just look at what happened in Central and South America, where a lot of those colonies eventually rise up for independence. You could still see the same thing happening in those other parts of the world, even without World War II. But maybe that's one of those, I don't feel strongly enough in saying that I would say he's wrong. I just think maybe a little differently about it.
Decolonization would not have been seen in Africa and Asia because the British and French would have the power to crack down on nationalist movements. The best thing for Africa and Asia independence movements was for their colonial masters to kill each other in 2 devastating conflicts. In this alternate timeline, without it, who knows how long it could have been before these lands would be free from Britain, France, or Germany. As for the specifics, what Germany would get from a victory is hard to say. They could disarm the French and demilitarize some areas, or gained a few of their colonies. However, we have no idea what the Germans would have done had they actually won the war.
I think that taking the colonies makes a lot of sense because you see kind of a foreshadowing of that with the Germans trying to keep the British out of the war by telling them, hey, we don't want to take any French territory, we're just going to take a couple of their colonies if we win the war. So they absolutely would have, at the very least, done that.
It's all speculation. This video was to help clarify and give you an idea about what potentially could have happened if the war ended so quickly. What do you think would have happened if the Schlieffen Plan succeeded? Like on Facebook and subscribe if you have not done so. This is Cody from the Alternate History Hub.
Alright, so like I said, that's a shorter video there, just a couple of closing thoughts. If you didn't see the previous parts of this series, I'll put links in the description not only to the video about the Schlieffen Plan over on the Great War channel, but also to part 1 of this look at the alternate history of it. And make sure your subscription is active because some friends of mine who are YouTubers have been seeing people unsubscribed who said that they never unsubscribe. So double check that your notifications are on. That way when I upload my other video later today about the trip, you'll get that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.